In 1994, I watched my first Launceston Walking Club Do You Know Tasmania annual slideshow. I was a teenager, obsessed with Tasmania's mountains, but in this small theatre I saw a quite different adventure. 3 guys were washing down a river called the Jane on lilos, packs half submerged with homemade wooden paddles. It looked cold, slippery and wet, and the narrated stories sounded gruelling. They basically looked like drowned rats with packs. After the show, I met John McLean and asked him if lilos were easy to steer. John explained that it was more about hope than steering.
Back then, the old track to the Jane River goldfields was already deteriorating, and since then, the bridges have all washed out and the scrub's grown up, making it much harder these days. Lilos were the best compromise of weight and packability, and they could be repaired in the field. Through my late teens and 20s, I eagerly explored the southwest rivers, photographing the gorges and sometimes finding evidence of pining activity. They were hard trips with heavy loads, and a few were first ever descents. For some of my mates, one trip was enough, and they still talk about that trip we did, with no plan to ever repeat it. These trips were not without risk either, and most preceded the days of satellite communication. On my last lilo trip in 2001, I was swept under a logjam on the difficult New River, and I nearly drowned, breaking several ribs in the process. Fortunately, EPIRBs had just become available, and after a night of chest pain, we pressed the button for external evacuation.
In 2005, John and I started looking for craft we could carry and then paddle upstream to reach the remote Provis Hills in the central southwest, and later the Princess Range north of the Gordon River. Both peaks were surrounded by a sea of severe scrub. Although successful, the folding craft were immensely heavy. After contemplating the World River from the peaks of the Jubilee Range in 2008, we discovered pack rafts, and April saw us inflating our new boats below the spectacular World River Arch. The next summer, we planned an ambitious first ascent of the Maxwell River by using the Jane to get near its source. This was a magnificent trip, deep into the heart of the Western Rivers, and we found large swathes of untouched Huon pines. Visiting Strawn, I fell into conversation with Snowy Morrison at the historic Huon Pine sawmill. He said they'd worked the lower Maxwell, and we spoke about hauling the punts up the sides of the big drops in the lower Denison River. The mill fascinated my young son David, and I have a photo of Snowy kindly helping him saw an offcut of Huon. A decade later, David was now tall and strong and keen for a challenge. John and I had lately focused on the far southwest, but it was time to return to the big western gorges.
Dad and John introduced me to wilderness packrafting on the Upper Franklin with a trip to the Erebus with a walkout of a Frenchman's Cap. The next summer we paddled the whole river. When Dad came up with the idea of climbing out of the Great Ravine to get to the Jane River, I was enthusiastic. I'd learnt a lot on the last 2 trips, and Dad and John were very experienced in remote wilderness. How hard could it be? John called the route the boilover, thinking we would climb from the rapid called the Cauldron. I didn't really appreciate that climbing a new trackless route out of one of Tasmania's deepest gorges with food for 2 weeks would be quite different to the solid but known climb out of the Erebus with food for 2 days.
To visualise the route, Matt and I climbed Frenchman's eastern peaks to look at the climb out of the Great Ravine. The winter light and cloud around Frenchman's was just magic on that recon trip, but it looked a long way from the headwaters of the Jane to the valleys of the Erebus rivulet. In the end, I couldn't get away for this expedition, but I volunteered to drop the boys off at the Collingwood River, and I followed their updates closely.
Have fun!
It was late afternoon, but we had a lot of ground to cover, so we made the most of the evening light and started down the river.
I really enjoyed the rapids of Descension Gorge. This is a beautiful section where the river drops into the deeper Erebus.
So where are you planning on jumping?
I think this way here.
That's a big drop.
The first of several fronts hit and rain enveloped us as we entered the Great Ravine. We camped beside the coruscates and prepared ourselves for the next day's climb. Tomorrow night, we hope to be looking back down into this gorge from the high peaks above. The morning saw us break the still reflections as we paddled toward the Livingston rivulet.
Beautiful bit of water, isn't it?
The Livingston starts in the lakes below Frenchman's massive east face and ends as a cut through the walls of the ravine. The middle of the ravine has several long still stretches known as Transcendence Reach. the Transcendence all stops at Thunder Rush where the sound fills the cliffs. Our original plan was to climb out of the gorge from the cauldron, but we had noted several alternatives from satellite images. One of them was to climb here.
Well, we've got our gear packed into the rather huge beasts. David's choosing which one he wants to get. Which one do you reckon?
I'll read this one first.
Okay. Can you get that thing on your back?
No idea. Oh, bloody hell. Oh, that's heavy.
That's enormous. What a monster. What a monster.
Oh, that's not good. Alright, let's go. The climb out proved to be as brutal as we imagined. For the early part, the scrub wasn't too bad, but as we got higher up, it got thicker and thicker, and the effort required to pull uphill against the botanical obstacles was extreme.
I knew what they had to do that day would be a Grade 1 sufferfest.
Living the dream. David, what an effort.
Yeah, bloody hell.
But we've made it out of the Great Ravine. Great.
And a whole day, it was like about 9 hours of walking.
Somewhere near them, surveyor and explorer James Calder would have stood in 1840, dismayed by the drop in front of him. It was Calder who named it the Great Ravine, and he knew it would be impassable, calling this ridge the Deception Range. Calder had been sent to cut a track to Macquarie Harbour and had climbed here from Lightning Plains to the east. The plains were named after he witnessed a lightning strike start a bushfire on Christmas Eve while they sheltered in a large rock cavern. Historic descriptions of the location of that rock cavern vary, but from the size, it is thought to be this one that Jesse Luckman rediscovered in the 1950s, naming it Christmas Rock. Many features around the rock, such as Milligan's Falls and the Surveyor Range, were named by Calder on that expedition and on his return to the plains in 1842, leading the Governor, Sir John Franklin, and the Lady Jane to Macquarie Harbour.
We left Calder's route and crossed the plains to where several creeks met the Little Jane and long pools began to appear. The hot afternoon and heavy loads made paddling and wading more attractive than bashing through the scrub. We made good progress until the gorge appeared under a prominent white bluff.
What's this gorge called?
Not named.
Right.
You can name it.
We referred to it as White Rock Gorge after the bluff at the start, but later decided it should be called Shamhat Gorge. It marked a major change in the character of the river and the start of the human pines. Not long after, we noticed an old piners camp with a surprising number of abandoned logs, each being centuries old.
The renowned Tasmanian conservationist Helen G had led the first modern expedition to descend the Jane in 1976 using lilos. Starting from the road to the goldfields, she named the Jane's 3 formidable gorges: Enkidu, Gilgamesh and Humbaba, after the major protagonists in the ancient Mesopotamian story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. A fourth character is Shamhat, who tamed and seduced the wild man Enkidu.
As we approached Standard Flat, we felt lucky to find a tall stand of hewn where only a few had been cut.
An enormous tree.
Unfortunately, these hewens also marked a change in the character of the river to a slow and tortuous stream with many false channels and old riverbeds forming islands. Increasing numbers of log jams meant an ongoing cycle of get out, wade, lift, drag and re-enter.
There's more log jams after this. I'm not going to be happy.
This is the mother of all log jams, isn't it?
The day ended with us carrying the boats and the discovery of another piners camp. We didn't know it, but this camp was very close to the resting place of John Stannard, a 19-year-old piner who had drowned. Since our visit, his grave has been rediscovered, having for many years been thought to be much further upstream. We wonder if he was carried to this bend with an initial thought to row his body out, as from here the river has better flow. The piners working the Jane cut tracks around the gorges and unnavigable sections, and then left the boats in the forest for travelling the flatter lengths. Hewn pine punts with oars have been found in good condition decades later.
There's the Arabic.
Yeah.
That's a bigger river now.
Definitely. So maybe our furthest point east. We've been heading west until here. Now we go south through Enkidu Gorge and then back to the Franklin.
At last we reached a log jam where the river became steeper. This was the start of Enkidu, and the rocks and logs were incredibly slippery.
We had now eaten enough food that we could shoulder our fully loaded boats for short distances, which improved our time by not having to do a two-person lift for each portage. This economy, however, had a cost that we discovered that night.
The afternoon brought welcome sunshine to warm us as we negotiated the beautiful passages of the first half of the gorge. Dad recalled on his prior journey that there was just a short portage in the latter half that had ended with a cliff that they had to lower the boats down. The reality was that there were two portages where we deflated the boats and carried our rucksacks, and there was more than one cliff. After the second major portage, it was well after 4 p.m. We were starting to be concerned that we wouldn't find anywhere flat to sleep. Well into the evening, we stood on a huge flat-top boulder next to a big fall in a narrow channel. We seriously considered putting the tent up on this flat rock. Ahead we could see promising slabs on the western bank, but when we dropped down, I couldn't get any traction to climb out. Instead, we carefully rearranged the log jams so that we could launch our boats beneath it and then begin the search for a tent site.
On opening the boats to retrieve our gear that night, we made the discovery that two chambers filled with heavy gear for another week on the river had ripped out their attachment. Late night repairs were carefully made with Tyvek tape.
Morning. A little tent site looking out at the end of Enkidu Gorge. Happy to find anything flat here. So far so good. This big dead tree goes over our tent. Has remained a big suspended dead tree.
We were quickly ejected from the gorge on bounty rapids. Suddenly, we were at the Algonquin rivulet, the southern border of the old goldfields. The river meanders through this section between Enkidu and Gilgamesh, bordered by dark forests and bluffs of limestone. After the previous days of scrub, log jams and gorges, it was nice to feel like we were moving and just be able to enjoy the surroundings.
The Acheron River joins from Mount Seal, and we were again in country visited by that tough 1840s surveyor, James Cowder. He called this the Black Forest. Not long past the Acheron lies Gilgamesh, the most spectacular of the James Gorges. Round the corner was a stunning passage with tall ancient trees spanning the river above us. Gilgamesh was making a good first impression. But then it all changed. Dark clouds rolled back in, the river dropped suddenly into churning pools, and within an hour we were back in drizzle, with the boats packed up, picking our way along the banks, looking for a clear run in the river below. Soon we would be climbing up and down, descending narrow chasms between cliffs, and traversing forest-clad slopes as we negotiated this magnificent gorge.
Eventually, we dropped onto a rolling shelf that traversed down a bluff where we rested. The shelf overlooked a sensational waterfall that took the volume of the whole river. Ahead was a long cliff face that would be time-consuming to traverse. The river dropped into a treacherous sieve below large boulders. Across the river, the fast water afforded no place to get out. Fortunately, we avoided having to carry the boats back upstream and over a bluff by lining them over.
This is a precarious little campsite tonight.
That side is hanging off the edge of some flat rock.
Heavy rain and thunder rolled into the darkness. That thunder echoing around Gilgamesh was unforgettable.
Well, back to rain in the river.
At the end of the gorge, we both looked back upstream and agreed that it was truly a spectacular and especially memorable place. You never know if you will return to a place as remote as this. The weather really rolled in now, and we welcomed the shelter of limestone overhangs. The misty scene as we left was sensational. Finally we arrived at Humbaba, the Jane's last gorge. This turned out to be beautiful and quite different to Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Green mosses draped sheared cut cliffs, the cascades spanned the river, and in places you could see the distant hills. The most spectacular cascade of all was near the end of the gorge, where the entire river thundered over a large trough, churning out huge amounts of spray into the surrounding forest.
At long last we rounded a corner, and I saw a stranded tree skeleton that I had noticed when we passed the Jane a year ago. Then we washed into the Franklin.
We've done the Jane. And now we are on the Franklin. Off he goes.
We had the customary stop at Flat Island, looking up at the Elliott Range that would dominate our skyline for the next 2 days.
Our journey would take us past the limestone cliffs and ancient caves to the Gordon. We lunched at the old hydro hut that has recently been renovated, then continued on our journey through a 4-season stay. Unlike previous trips ending at Heritage Landing, this time we continued out onto Macquarie Harbour, probably surprising the tour boat on our way. It was strange going past the World Heritage sign as we left the Gordon and entered the windswept harbour, but it gave a wild feel to the end of this river trip. We paddled across the southwest edge of the harbour with a beam sea that required constant focus on staying the right direction.
Scores of convicts, piners and explorers would have rowed across these waters, collecting the hue and pines from the Gordon River and limestone and coal from around the river's edges. I was tired and keen to be home now, but also awed. This is a land of stories and survival, harsh and delicate. It has been a home and a challenge for thousands of years.